In September 1955, ITV took to the airwaves and ended the BBC's monopoly of British television. One of ITV's unique features has been its regional structure, which was especially strong in the north of England, and for many years Granada, Yorkshire TV and Tyne Tees made programmes that were popular throughout the UK. Today, though, ITV is no longer a collection of regional stations, and in Archive on 4 now, Mark Lawson examines why by taking a look at what happened to one of its biggest companies.
This is the story of how, over a number of decades and without anyone noticing until it was too late, Yorkshire disappeared. In fact, it wasn't a single county that vanished from the map. The territory that went missing also stretched to Lincolnshire and North Norfolk. And although his involvement was inadvertent, a prime suspect in the loss of a large part of northern England was this man.
The truth is, you are completely and utterly useless.
Look at any road atlas of the UK or list of county cricket fixtures, and Yorkshire still exists. What has gone, in any meaningful sense, is the regional ITV company which began broadcasting from new studios in Leeds on July the 29th, 1968.
This is Yorkshire Television, broadcasting from the Emley Moor, Belmont and associated transmitters of the Independent Broadcasting Authority.
One of the most powerful series made by Yorkshire Television in its 4 decades of independent existence was an extraordinary invocation of an old way of life, struggling to survive in the modern world.
Hannah Hawkswell was left on her own when her mother, the last of her family, died 12 years ago. In the house, there's no electricity, no water on tap. When she wants a cup of tea, she has to go to the stream in the field where the cattle graze.
I think I have a system of keeping expenditure down to the very bare necessities.
What about food? What did you have for your lunch today?
Butter and bread.
Hannah Hawkswell, a northern farmer living into the 21st century, an existence from a Thomas Hardy novel. The subject of award-winning documentaries made by Barry Cockcroft, and one of the memorable items from the Yorkshire TV archives, which will feature in this programme. But like Hannah, the company itself now represents a nostalgically distant way of doing things, which was replaced by a new, brutally commercial modernity. Created to broadcast programmes from Yorkshire, largely about Yorkshire, the regional power base has been submerged, since 2007, into a London-run business in which the single most powerful player is an international music mogul, Simon Cowell. And so in this sense, the rise and fall of Yorkshire Television also stands for what has happened to British commercial TV over the last 40 years. Austin Mitchell, Labour MP for Grimsby in the Yorkshire transmission area, was, before entering politics, presenter of the local news programme Calendar.
Cutting of the regional route is going to weaken ITV. It turns it into just another jukebox and playing in the background. The whole idea of ITV was to get production out of London, and it did. We built a marvellous television centre in Leeds on Kirkstall Road, a big centre. It encouraged Yorkshire talent and Yorkshire programmes, and it meant that anybody who wanted to go into the media instead of having to go to London, follow the Golden Road to the Great Wen, could work in Leeds and produce quality stuff. Now, that's over now.
Actually, I think it's a real cultural loss. I think that having a number of television stations with roots in the community where the people working there lived locally, send kids to the local schools, understood what was happening to their part of Britain, and then could reflect that back both within the county or the area, but also reflect it more widely to the rest of the nation, actually was something very powerful. And the relationship between the viewers in Yorkshire and Yorkshire Television was incredibly strong bond. It was, like a football team. There was that sort of sense that, you were their television station, you were there to represent them, and they felt very strongly about what you did and how you behaved and the kind of stories you told them.
John Willis, who made many award-winning Yorkshire documentaries, including Johnny Go Home. The story of ITV, like the history of broadcasting itself, turns on the question, how many channels should there be? Now, as we scroll down a digital menu of available networks, the numbers look like a cricket score. But until the middle of the 1950s, British TV resembled a football result. BBC won, the rest nil. In 1955, with the launch of a commercial rival under the banner ITV, or Independent Television, it became 1-1, although the result was complicated because the new outfit contained scores of different broadcasters, serving different regions. The north of England was served by Granada, which explains Jeremy Isaacs, whose career as a TV executive started there, was located not just for artistic reasons, but also meteorological ones.
You know that they looked at the rainfall atlas before deciding which franchise to bid for. And so they bid for the north, including the northwest, because they thought most people would be at home at nights watching.
Sidney Bernstein and his nephew Alex were typical of the pioneers of ITV. Granada's previous involvement with screen entertainment had been as an owner of a chain of cinemas and a TV rental business. Other firms dealing in TV sets, Associated Rediffusion, and Cinemas ABC were also among the earliest ITV providers. Associated Rediffusion broadcasting to London on weekdays, while ABC covered the north at weekends, taking over from Granada on Friday nights. All these companies had come into television as a corporate precaution. The expansion of the medium in Britain might hit profits in their cinemas, but the growth of stay-home entertainment would lead to more sales and rentals of sets. So becoming broadcasters was a way of protecting income. And after some initial problems with the sheer cost of making television, an ITV franchise came to be regarded, in a famous phrase of the time, as a licence to print money. Nick Elliott, later controller of drama for the ITV network, began his career at Granada.
Sales directors used to say you just had to book a bucket outside the door for the advertisers to tip their subscriptions in. In those days, television, particularly ITV, had no consciousness of money, and they were private companies, so there was no terrified quoting of the stock market and the reactions to the stock market and the price of our shares. And certainly at Granada, there was a culture of making the very best programmes they could, and had a sort of fearlessly independent culture. So we would take on politicians, we would do not ratings-type programmes if we wanted, and there were some great programmes around. World in Action was challenging everything it could, and there were Disappearing World documentaries being made, and great dramas too.
Another young employee of Granada was Jeremy Isaacs, later director of programmes at Thames Television in London and controller of Channel 4. In that first phase of the ITV network, Yorkshire was part of Granada Land, the Spanish-sounding territory mapped out by the Bernsteins.
I think you have to look in the atlas a very long time to find Granada, except in the south of Spain. And Sidney, of course, couldn't stand anybody else calling themselves Granada, and he tried to injunct the Ford Motor Corporation to prevent them calling a motor car the Granada, and lost. But Granada Land, which was what we called it, or what the company called it, extended from the Irish Sea to the North Sea. And we went to Scarborough to make programmes. And the company had an office in Leeds.
In 1963, the Independent Broadcasting Authority, the government-run regulator, extended the opening set of 1955 franchises to run until 1968. But the chairman, Lord Hill, who had first become known dispensing medical advice on the radio, had privately diagnosed an outbreak of galloping arrogance among the young ITV companies, and the IBA was determined to make big changes after 13 years. Associated Rediffusion lost London weekdays to Thames, and Granada's licence was reshaped to serve the northwest, with a new Yorkshire region centred around the Emley Moor transmitter. Recruitment of staff began.
We knew that it was going to happen, a Yorkshire Television franchise, but personally, from my point of view, I was in this very building, Broadcasting House, as a producer on the Today programme, and the phone rang, and this Welsh voice said, "If you look out the window, boy, you'll see who's talking to you." And Yorkshire Television had an office, the winning franchise, just over the road, and "Oh, come and see me, boy." And to this day, I don't know how Baverstock had fingered me, but I walked over the road and, went to the new Yorkshire Television.
And in that opening encounter with Baverstock, what vision did he offer you of Yorkshire?
Oh, well, Baverstock was a very, very sort of wildly enthusiastic and charismatic figure, and he just said we were going to change the world. This was going to give a vigour and variety and a bit of intellectual weight and all sorts of things to ITV. Come and join us.
John Fairley, who later became Director of Programmes at Yorkshire, a title initially filled by the man who recruited him, Donald Baverstock, an admired former BBC current affairs producer. Baverstock had run the magazine show Tonight, where one of his reporters had been Alan Wicker, who also got the call to Yorkshire, although he thinks rather fortuitously.
I met one day a chap who was concerned with Yorkshire Television. He was I think he was the public relations director, and a very nice guy indeed. And he was asked by the people in the consortium, like Ward Thomas. He was asked that they would like that he searched out some new talent and new concerned talent. And then a dramatic event which affected all of us. He went to his office and decided to make phone calls throughout the day. And he started by moving his address book to the upside down, as it were. So we started with the Zs. And there weren't too many Zs, but there were quite a lot of Ws, and one of which was me.
After the removal of lightweight or light-hearted bidders, including Diddy TV, headed by the comedian Ken Dodd, two groups were competing for the licence to print money in the three ridings. One consortium was backed by the Yorkshire Post newspaper, the other by the Telefusion chain of television shops, continuing the strong role of rental firms in the early history of ITV. The regulator asked the rival companies to join together, and Yorkshire Television, headed by Donald Baverstock and Ward Thomas, was born. New studios, ready for the imminent arrival of colour television, were built in Leeds.
Here is the car, arriving with Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Kent and the Earl of Scarborough to perform his opening ceremony.
But from early on there were problems. Some were small, such as culture shock for the newcomers from the south, including John Fairley.
I took my then girlfriend up with me, talked to her fast as I went past Ferrybridge Power Station and Kellingley Colliery, because she was a nice southern girl. Took her into a pub in the middle of Leeds and ordered her a half pint of beer, and the barman refused to serve. We don't serve women here, sir. So it was quite tough from that point of view.
Other difficulties were more fundamental. When I interviewed Nick Elliott, who spent his ITV career mainly at Granada and LWT, he passed on a piece of gossip about Yorkshire dramas.
The floor of the Yorkshire studio is unique in that instead of being built with something like you've got in your studio here, it's got wooden boards. And when the artists or the cameras move across it, they creak in an alarming way. I never had to work on it, but people who made Emmerdale used to tell me what a nightmare it was.
When you watched a tape of Yorkshire Show, could you ever hear? You say, I can hear the floor creaking.
Oh, I think so, yes.
So I asked Keith Richardson, another of the early recruits who later became Yorkshire's head of drama, if Nick Elliott had, as it were, heard correctly.
Yes, the Emmerdale studio has a wooden floor, and this comes down to cost. When we built that studio, they proposed a wooden floor, and I said, but this is insanity. I mean, it will, start to sink. If they're dollying cameras, it'll jump. And equally, every time somebody walks across it, it'll make a phenomenal racket, a terrible noise. And Ward Thomas, who was in charge at the time, said to whoever I had complained to, I built these studios without producers interfering, and I'll build this one, So they went ahead with the wooden floor, which has been a disaster. Actors have to wear bits of carpet on their shoes.
So when you watch an episode of Emmerdale, can you hear the creaking?
I can, yes. I'm incredibly conscious of it, yeah.
I could have said a lot before family early, but I prefer to keep it between parties concerned. Just keep your tongue quiet till I've done. You walked out on your dad just when he needed help. And apart from a letter now and again, I've had sight and sign of you.
But it's my farm now, isn't it?
Right. But it's a hard living here. And what we eat, we work for. Milking's at 6. I'll give you a call.
Yorkshire, in common with the wider ITV network, both then and later, was also troubled by industrial disputes. A strike took the new company off air almost as soon as it had arrived on air.
I got a letter from Donald Baverstock saying if I was in Yorkshire, would I drop in and see them? Vroom! I was up there like a shot. And I got the next train north to Leeds, where I found that Yorkshire Television was all on strike. They'd all closed down.
Did you have to cross a picket line to audition?
No. I mean, there were picket lines from time to time. The Electrical Trade Unions was a fairly left-wing organisation at that stage. I remember Arthur Scargill would never come in if there was a picket line of any kind. He'd just turn round and went home again. And the same was true of Dennis Skinner.
A common opinion in right-wing politics, and newspapers of the same shade, was that ITV's frequent strikes were an attempt to protect unfeasible staffing levels and working methods. This view of the studios would later have profound consequences for Yorkshire and the rest of the ITV system. So was the company overmanned and inefficient?
I remember setting out once with a 12-car convoy behind me, and I didn't know where the hell we were going, and I was in charge. But yours had to go on assignments with a big crew. Nowadays, they do it with one-man or two-men crews. But we always would stop filming about 12 o'clock to look at the Good Food Guide and find the best restaurant roundabout while some poor lad went back with the film to be processed.
But 12 vans is like a presidential motorcade. What was in all these vans?
Well, I was in the one lead van with the producer. Behind us was the director. Behind him was the electrician with all the lights and an electrician's assistant. They had a big van. Then came the camera crew, and you'd have a cameraman and an assistant cameraman. You'd have a soundman and an assistant soundman. And then somewhere in the melee, you'd have the grips.
Going right back to the early days, I mean, yes, it was hugely overstaffed, probably hugely overpaid. I mean, people would get onto aeroplanes to go make a documentary on the other side of the world, and they would start the clock ticking when they got on the aeroplane, and of course they would then move into overtime in the air. And by the time they arrived where they were going, if it was Australia, you know, they were on sort of 5 or 6 times their rate. Well, these kind of practices had to stop. I remember once we were contemplating doing something in Germany. We had to take the unions with us to show them what we intended to do. And they came back with all this heavy list of demands that they would only travel first class, and there weren't to be any children in first class. You know, they wanted peace and quiet. And you say, well, even if you're paying the full rate and you're paying first class, you cannot guarantee to have no children on the aeroplane. But that was the sort of craziness of the time.
Technicians would point out that there's little evidence that the management from this time retired to live in poverty on low pensions. And the shares he had in Yorkshire TV are one reason that Alan Wicker is able to live in the Channel Islands. But very early in its existence, the company suffered an interruption of transmission which could not be attributed to manning. Insurance forms would have blamed an act of God.
I'd been over to Manchester with Baverstock, and I was driving back across the Pennines, and we noticed that the barbed wire it was February, I think, was gathering ice. I mean, an inch or two of ice, like you hear of on trawler hawsers and things, which I'd never seen before or since. And it gathered 6 feet thick on the wires of the Emily Moore transmitter and just pulled it down.
And so what, it just Yorkshire went off air, did it?
Yes. We did have another transmitter on the south bank of the Humber, so we were transmitting to about, I think, a third of the audience. And some miraculous poles, along with some iron recovered from Sweden, put up a temporary mast within a couple of weeks. It's not very long anyway, and it worked very, very well for, I think, a couple of years before they managed to build a new one that's still there now.
But when the mast went down, there must have been some panic, was there?
Well, you can imagine there was alarm, that's for sure.
But while bad news for most people is a disaster, for a journalist, bad news is a story. And one of Yorkshire's new on-screen stars, Richard Whiteley, told it.
Emily Moor, a bleak, easterly slope in the Pennines just above Huddersfield. A home for hardy sheep, and the home also of Yorkshire Television's lifeline to its region of 7 million viewers. The giant tube, which pokes 1,200 feet into the freezing air, pumps out Yorkshire's television signals from Teesside to Lincolnshire. The pop programme Discotheque is being sent out to the region. The time is 1 minute and 45 seconds past 5 o'clock in the afternoon, precisely.
And I was shouting at Richard when the second half wasn't quite ready in time. And he said, well, there's nobody going to watch it.
I was going to say, so this was the irony. You had this fantastic story, but only perhaps a third of the audience would watch it, able to watch it. Yeah.
But at least it was a third of the audience, as I reminded him.
In describing the problems of the company's start, a transmitter that wouldn't stay up, staff who wouldn't stay at work, it's important to acknowledge that this was balanced by widespread enthusiasm and creativity.
The great thing about Yorkshire was that there was a fantastic sense that it was all new and exciting, and you were shaping television, you were shaping what Yorkshire Television did, and it was made up basically of outsiders, people who were outside the sunlit uplands of Thames or Granada, and so we were outsiders, both kind of physically being in the north and outsiders from the system. So it felt like anything was possible.
John Willis. In 1973, Paul Fox was recruited from the BBC to become managing director of Yorkshire, finding a stable transmitter and growing audience.
I came into a company that was had some good drama. Peter Wills was there doing the drama. It had no light entertainment whatsoever. I think more or less the first decision I took up there was to cancel a so-called comedy show called Sir Yellow with Jimmy Edwards. And I brought in Duncan Wood from the BBC to run the comedy, and that led to Rising Damp and other things. And, of course, we had a first-class documentary department run by John Fairley, with people like John Willis around and others, and won awards, programmes like Johnny Go Home, and very good local programmes.
After the new ITV licences were issued in 1968, the names of the companies illustrated a big and symbolic shift. The brand names of TV shops and cinema chains, Rediffusion, ABC, were replaced by networks with a regional stamp, Thames, Yorkshire. This process would continue over the decades, with the Midlands franchise passing from ATV to Central, until the only anomaly that remained was the Spanish name on North West programmes. And the shows produced by Yorkshire tended to be true to the name on its transmission card. Calendar established a tradition of strong news from around the county, which made the presenters into celebrities.
I live in Sherwood Forest, close by the M1. This is the 12th century, an action replay. I fight against King John and the Sheriff of Nottingham. I fight for King Richard. My mistress is Maid Marian. At least I thought all this was true until I got hold of this book. Called Robin Hood of Wakefield. It tells me that I shouldn't be here at all.
One of the men who signed this pamphlet is Arthur Scargill of Yorkshire. Now, a lot of people in the union must look at you with suspicion and think, what are you after? What exactly are you after?
I'm after democratising this union, giving the miners in the British coalfield a square deal, and this is in association with a lot more people in the coalfield who hold similar views to myself.
Because if you come to York these days, you can go bottom pinching for 10p with girls like Sue here. Sue! Why? Why are you offering 10p to have your bottom pinched?
It's to get publicity for the York Festival.
Well, I wish them the best of success, but I think they've got a right cheap.
Excuse me, madam. Excuse me. I'm robbing the rich to feed the poor.
Oh, I thought you were Robin Hood.
They used to come to you and say, it's a phrase that Richard Whiteley or I devised. I think he stole it from me. He thinks he invented it, thought he invented it. It's Imhoff. You suffer from the Imhoff syndrome, and people would look at you in the street and diagnose it straight away. It's Imhoff! And then they would slow down. Imhoff what? They'd usually say Imhoff look north, or sometimes Imhoff calendar, and then they'd give you interesting bits of information about yourself, like you're fatter, taller, thinner than you look on television. Recognition was pretty widespread. I mean, we were the dominant programme. We knocked Look North into a cocked hat, really, in viewing figures.
As is always the case with the best local journalism, Calendar had the inside track when regional news became national. One of these occasions is now the subject of a popular movie. In 1974, Brian Clough, then one of Britain's most successful football managers, replaced the revered Don Revie as Leeds United manager, but lasted for only 44 days. So cinema audiences around the world are now watching a recreation of Austin Mitchell's live interview on Calendar with both Clough and Revie.
They smartened it up in the film. It's a much better interview than the one I actually conducted. It was interesting, really, because the film interprets it as if Clough was tricked, not knowing that Revy was in the studio waiting to do. Well, Clough knew, Revy knew. The thing they were both concerned with was how much were they going to be paid. I was recruited for the interview because I was the only person around who was still sober. All the others had gone home. I knew very little about football. I knew nothing about football. But John Wilford, who was in charge of the whole thing, said he'd brief me and tell me what the questions to ask through the earpiece, for which I was grateful. But in any case, there was no need. It was so fascinating just watching them.
Tell me this, when you walked in, did you have a meeting the first day with them?
No.
Why?
Because I didn't think it was necessary to have a meeting the very first day.
So you were taking over as manager of a new club?
Yes.
And you don't call all your players and your coaching staff and your office staff together?
No.
And introduce yourself and meet them and tell them exactly what you feel and what you want to try and do?
Dawn! The first day I walked in, I came back from holiday and I did 2 hours training with them.
Irrespective of what you do...
I went out on the field with them.
Right, you went out on the field. My immediate reaction to any job, the same at the Football Association, I got 70 people together and went to a cocktail party and I introduced myself to them.
That is your way.
And I talked about Ramsey's record. I talked how great Ramsey was.
Yes.
His record as a professional man. I never got close to Ramsey. He was a cold man. But as a professional
I think you
man,
are.
As a cold man?
Yes.
Oh, don't ask our players that. Or they'll laugh their socks down.
It's striking how many of the significant figures in Yorkshire's history, Richard Whiteley, John Fairley, John Willis, began on Calendar, which came to serve as an unofficial trainee scheme. And the strong regional identity also extended to the shows created to be screened nationally on the ITV network. The major dramas were frequently Yorkshire stories, Flambards, Heartbeat.
Now then, Alf, make a change having someone like you round, Nick. Southerner.
And Emmerdale, or as it was more rurally known at the beginning, Emmerdale Farm.
No sign of him, then?
You should know better than expecting.
But he ought to be here for his dad's funeral. In you get, Grandad. Take it slow. I don't want Jacob bumped about on his last ride.
There was always that tradition in Yorkshire of rather old-fashioned, in a way, not very ambitious from a writing point of view, but usually pretty Yorkshire, very regional and a strong loyalty and defence of their own region and their own regional strengths, but usually very strong in the ratings. I mean, they told stories in the ways which would get audiences. I seem to remember the Beiderbecke Affair was a more distinguished piece of drama. It was used the influence of jazz very strongly. That was Yorkshire. The larger part of Yorkshire were always very solidly good programme makers from a scheduling point of view, and a smaller tradition of sort of slightly more spiky, interesting things. I mean, particularly Yorkshire were very strong for a time in the world of documentaries.
Attached to the place because my family have lived here since my great-grandfather's time. No one else has lived in this house since it was built but our family. And the lovely countryside down the new, through the Iron Gate, down the new road. And I've often thought, sometimes it's my favourite walk. And I've stopped and looked and I've thought, well, it's one thing, if I haven't money in my pocket, it's one thing nobody can rob me of. Nobody can... It's mine. It's mine for the taking.
That non-fictional farmer, Hannah Hawkswell, came from the documentary unit travelling northeast to the territory of its ITV neighbour and later business partner, Tyne Tees. And many of the factual films which made the most impact found their stories at points east, west and south.
Euston, 9 p.m. Every day, 20 kids arrive at the mainline stations with nowhere to go. Unbelievably, there are probably 25,000 homeless youngsters in London.
John Willis's film Johnny Go Home, its title deliberately alluding to Ken Loach's classic drama documentary about the homeless, Cathy Come Home, was screened in 1975 in 2 parts either side of the ITV News at 10.
Could you tell us how you pick up a customer? Explain.
Well, I go down to, say, the West End Playland. You just hang around the machines there, and usually very quickly somebody will approach you. they'll ask you if you want a coffee or something like that. You go back to their place.
In the case of Johnny Go Home, we started, with quite a small idea about runaway kids lost on the street of London. And because we stumbled across a murder in the course of the documentary, the film eventually took a long time to make and ran for 2 hours. But that's not how it started. These days, it's pretty hard to imagine that happening.
Well, also, I think that's very important because, as you well know, in more recent years in TV documentaries, there's been this idea that you had to tell the people who commissioned it exactly what you were going to get and what the narrative would be and go and do records and so on. This was a classic example of just stumbling, really, on the real subject of the film.
I think the power of documentaries is really that you have no idea how the film is going to end, unlike a reality programme where there's some certainty there's going to be jeopardy and drama at the end of it. But with documentaries, you don't know, and this was a perfect example of that. We met a couple of young kids and we went on a journey with them, and we had no idea where the journey was going to end up. As it happened, it was in a pretty dark and horrible place, but that made it a more powerful film.
From its Yorkshire base, Willis's unit found headline-making and award-winning stories in Nottinghamshire.
From the male wards, we moved on to Rampton's women patients.
What was the most frightening thing to you about it?
Being treated like an animal.
And Cumbria.
Tonight on First Tuesday, the nuclear plant at Windscale. How safe is it?
20 years ago, nobody would have thought that the plutonium would actually come back to the land once it's discharged into the sea. Slowly but surely it's coming back.
We examine the safety records. And we ask what caused the cancers in the local children.
If I were a parent in the village, I would be concerned about my children.
I was a troublemaker, and I had a very, very strong sense of what I and my colleagues thought was right and wrong. And we then set about making films about those subjects. So if many millions of people were suffering because of the iniquities of the asbestos industry, we tried to tell the story as it is. Or if patients were being ill-treated in Rampton Hospital, then we tried to expose that. So I think that we thought that one of the things that we were there to do, and we had the freedom to do, perhaps as importantly, was actually to dig around and cause trouble. And actually, the same thing was happening probably, across the Pennines at World in Action too.
Willis's film about the nuclear power plant at Windscale, later renamed Sellafield, was transmitted in the First Tuesday strand, a deal with the ITV network, which guaranteed Yorkshire a dozen national slots for factual films each year. In common with all ITV companies, Yorkshire had a double duty, making programmes to be shown only in their own county, but others to be shown across the country. Some Yorkshire programmes seemed born to be seen abroad, because they were set there.
In the first half of this century, Hong Kong's floating population grew to 100,000. It's the size of York or Oxford. 6,000 boats, from squat sampans where perhaps 10 people live out their lives, to proud ocean-going cargo junks populated by an aristocratic family or two or three.
I was first concerned with their evening news programme, Calendar, and I did one or two gentle little pieces, which was much easier and far more gentle than Life under Donald Baverstock and Alistair Milne. This was easy meat, and then I found that a happy and easy way to go. And then we decided to make some hour-long programmes. The calendar programmes had been rather like The Tonight Show on BBC, had been a quiet segment, 5 or 10 minutes. Then I got onto larger segments, such as Percy Shaw was one, a wonderful Yorkshire original, and he became quite well known and a successful figure. And we did one or two like that, and they were all dramatically successful, really. They pushed the opposition out of the way.
Alan Wicker. Duty Free, a sitcom by Eric Chappell and Jean Waugh, set during a package holiday in Spain, was another show with an international setting, although filmed in those Leeds studios with the creaky floors, which found easy national acceptance. So was another Eric Chappell series, Rising Damp, which extended the long tradition of flat share and house share sitcoms by focusing on the character of the landlord, Rigsby, played by Leonard Rossiter.
Got rising damp, my furniture's falling to pieces.
How can you have rising damp in the attic, eh? If you're higher than the crows up there, should be very healthy, like Switzerland.
Switzerland? Rigsby, my suits are going green.
Yes, I don't deny your suits are going green, but it is not rising damp.
What is it then?
Condensation.
There's an interesting story about that. His name wasn't Rigsby, it was a play originally called The Banana Box, and his name was Rooksby, which has a far more Dickensian flavour, obviously rooking people. I was doing some filming in Scarborough, and a chap from newspaper came along and asked me what I was going to do in the future, and I told him about this character, and he put it in the paper. And 2 days later, the Yorkshire Television had an irate letter from a bloke who said, "My name is Rooksby, I run a boarding house. If you do this, I shall sue you." So poor Eric Chappell, who wrote it, had to think of a new name, and he came up with Rigsby.
The late Leonard Rossiter speaking on Desert Island Discs. But the ITV network was a house share with several different landlords, and so every Monday morning in London, the regional barons, including Paul Fox or John Fairley of Yorkshire and Jeremy Isaacs of Thames, would meet to decide who got the best accommodation on the network. Paul Fox.
I thoroughly enjoyed the Monday morning meetings. Was it a carve-up? Well, we divided the programmes into a sensible arrangement for the week. The only problem was, of course, that it was a London split. I mean, the Thames were on the air for 5.5 days a week, and LWT for 2.5 days of the week. And of course, LWT, making good programmes themselves, only had 2.5 days to get the revenue. And therefore, they wanted the best possible audience-grabbing programmes at the weekend. Now, Thames weren't going to be done out of their audience-grabbing programmes, revenue-making programmes. So the battle was more between Thames and LWT rather than the other companies. Yorkshire was the smallest of the five. We weren't there on sufferance. We were there in our own right because we had, comedy like Rising Damp. There was competition for Rising Damp between the two London companies. Thames wanted it on Tuesday, LWT wanted it on Friday evening. Now, those were friendly discussions. There was never any animosity or anger. The language got a bit strong occasionally, but there was there was rivalry, of course. We were competitors.
Yeah, it was quite rough, but you used to have allies, and when I became director of programmes, Greg Dyke was the person I got on most with, and we particularly had a look at what we could do about the ITV weekend schedule, and there was what came to be known, at least inside ITV, as the jacuzzi schedule, which was dreamed up in a jacuzzi in Los Angeles by Greg and I while we were out there buying films and programmes for ITV. And that was...
Sorry, we have to stop you there.
Yeah.
Where was this jacuzzi? In a hotel in LA?
Yes, in a hotel in LA. And basically, we decided to put a lot of resources into weekend drama, which had been quite weak up till then. Out of that came Darling Buds of May and Touch of Frost and Heartbeat, and that was our contribution to it. So we actually had a very good relationship. The weekday relationship was always tougher.
John Fairley. But during much of 1979, the network barons didn't have to worry very much about who got what, because nothing was going anywhere. The technical strikes which had attended Yorkshire's birth returned, and like the company's biggest shows, went national.
The union problem was considerable. Not so much with the technicians. The union problem was with the electricians. And the electricians were a pain. The problem really was that most of them lived in Lancashire. They'd worked for ABC Television. And they didn't come down to London when the franchises changed. These chaps had to drive over the M62 every day, and of course they arrived at work bad-tempered, having driven into Leeds. And then secondly, they knew their work was coming to an end because lighting was no longer required. It was ludicrous to send a load of electricians on Alan Wicker documentaries around the world, but we had to do it.
The reason lighting was no longer required was that film
stock improved, all that sort of cameras improved, and lights were certainly no longer needed on documentaries abroad. It was absurd.
From the 10th of August to the 24th of October, commercial television screens were blank. Although the blackout was intermittently lifted in Yorkshire, to broadcast police appeals for information about a serial killer nicknamed the Ripper who was killing local women. ITV's rivals took advantage of its absence. It was during this time that To the Manor Born on BBC One achieved the highest audience ever for a comedy, 23.95 million. Eventually, ITV's transmitters were in action again, sounding happy. But the network's specially commissioned comeback anthem from the Mike Sam Singers didn't convince the newly elected Conservative government that the TV unions had changed their tune. Yorkshire continued to make powerful films, including another example of a local story going national.
A man is charged with a Ripper murder. His wife and his father go with him to court.
The man who for 5 years had killed and attacked women was caught at last. To have lived in fear of the Ripper is to comprehend hysteria which confuses relief with a desire for revenge. And understand the extent of grief.
The police came in and said, "Are you the father of Jane MacDonald?" I said, "Yes." I said, "I'll kill her when she comes home because she didn't phone last night." And they said, "You may not have to." And that's as much as I knew. If she'd have died of, illness or accident, but when it happens like it did, mutilation and everything, I went to identify her, and I just collapsed there and then.
I mean, he said he'd seen everything in the war, but nothing like that. When you were looking at your own flesh and blood, I didn't have to do it. I don't think I could have.
I had to retire early. The kid is, he's murdered the whole family, you can more or less say.
Within days, Mr. MacDonald died, his family say of a broken heart.
But the quality of the programmes was about to become far less important for the holders of ITV licences. Until then, companies had been judged on their potential schedules, leading to a phenomenon of public service programmes commissioned entirely to please the regulator, Keith Richardson.
It wasn't a blatant franchise thing, but it was an obvious thing to do, to say, look, we are serving the region and we're serving it well. For instance, there are 5 theatres. Maybe we should try harder to amalgamate what we do with what theatres do. And I dutifully toured around each theatre, talking to the directors of each theatre, saying, isn't there some way we could get into bed together? Alan Ayckbourn, as I remember, was very thrilled at the prospect, but we never, ever managed to get a television schedule and a theatre schedule together.
I remember reading about that, and indeed I think I interviewed Sarah Ayckbourn about it at one point. The idea was that the Stephen Joseph Theatre plays would end up on ITV.
Well, not all of them, but you would choose a play that would naturally allow them to cast up a bit if they knew it was going to be made into a television at the end. And if an actor who perhaps normally felt 300 quid a week at Alan's Theatre, but with a television performance at the end of it, made it more attractive and perhaps made it worth leaving London for. That was the idea behind it.
But, unhappy with the largely status quo results of the 1982 renewal round, Margaret Thatcher and her broadcasting ministers introduced for the dispersals of the next decade a new system in which those competing for stations would enter sealed bids, stating the amount they were willing to pay for continuing or taking over the wavelength. This blind auction was amended to include a quality threshold, so that a consortium with loads of money but no ideas would theoretically be excluded. But there had been a fundamental cultural change.
Mrs. Thatcher was never quite clear whom she hated more, the BBC or ITV. And then she appointed a committee of inquiry, usual thing, under Professor Peacock, Alan Peacock. And the job of that committee was to look into the financing of the BBC. I mean, what she hoped for was that Peacock would come up with a thing saying advertising will finance the BBC. And even Peacock, a great proponent of that, came to the conclusion that that would never work. And instead he turned his fire on ITV. And ITV was an easy target in those days. A, it was profitable. B, it was over-unionized. There's no doubt about it. And all guns were pointed at us, and there was a view within the cabinet, led by people like Nigel Lawson, David Young, and others, that ITV was too profitable, that it ought to be cut down to size, and there was no doubt that ITV as such did not react well to that political pressure.
Ever since its creation in 1955, the ITV network had been a balance, often uneasy, between learning and earning, public service and private profits. As early as 1974, Yorkshire had merged with its northeast neighbour Tyne Tees in a preview of the boardroom deals which would later become a major behind-the-scenes feature of commercial television. In 1982, the company had survived a rival bid for its licence from a consortium fronted by former Prime Minister Harold Wilson, but the commercial pressures were increasing, consolidated by the 1990 Broadcasting Act, which gave advertising-funded broadcasters greater freedom to mount takeovers. In the 1992 contests, Yorkshire, with two other outfits coveting its territory, bid £37.7 million. This successfully outspent the other contenders, but in every sense, the company had paid a high price.
Yorkshire Television had bidders against them, which meant that they kept literally plucking figures out of the air and ended up a bit like rail franchises currently, with a price that was very hard to sustain, which made things really, really difficult for a time.
There was a visible effect, a tangible effect on budgets and so on.
Yes, there was less money around.
ITV declined when cash became the most important thing. I mean, the IBA's decision, prompted by the Thatcher government, to say that cash should be the deciding factor was a disaster. People overspent. The Yorkshire Television management, I wasn't there any longer, I was at the BBC. The Yorkshire Television overspent massively and suffered ever afterwards and had to be rescued again by Ward Thomas. Programmes deteriorated, and above all, the regional system went out of the window.
When you talk, which is quite right, about Yorkshire having to spend so much to get the franchise back, in business terms, people were put in an impossible position, weren't they? They didn't know what the bid against them was going to be, and so they had to bid as high as they possibly could.
Not necessarily. I mean, in the end, there was what David Mellor liked to call the quality threshold. Now, Thames had an outstanding programme record. Their bid wasn't high enough. Carlton outbid them because they knew what the size of the Thames bid was going to be and had no programme record whatsoever. The IBA felt they had to give the contract to Carlton.
Whereas LWT bid very low and gambled, didn't they? And they got it and they all became very rich.
The LWT bid low because they thought a programme record would get them through. I think they probably knew what the other side were bidding. There was a certain amount of counterintelligence going on.
There was a double irony in the outcome of the franchise rounds conducted under the Thatcher and Major governments. The rising price of the licences reduced the quality of the programmes, but the introduction of this new system was also partly a punishment for some of the best programmes of the past. Apart from the perception of union abuse of power, the Conservatives were also angered by what they felt to be the left-wing bias of ITV Current Affairs, specifically the Death on the Rock documentary, a Thames film about the shooting by the SAS of 3 IRA members in Gibraltar, but also the wider factual output of commercial television, including the work of self-confessed troublemaker John Willis.
All politicians like to control or subvert or quieten opposition, and you see it with governments of all persuasions. But I think in this particular case, ITV, which you would have thought would have been friendly to Mrs. Thatcher because they were very, a set of commercial companies, actually editorially turned out not to be. And I think as a result, she was extremely unhappy. And Death on the Rock was clearly the fuse that was lit and sent the whole thing up.
Under the new arrangements, successful programmes continued to reflect the company's heartland.
You sure we don't need backup, sir?
No, our greatest weapon lies right here, 1 inch beneath my nose.
Your moustache.
Moustache, cheeky sod.
But you didn't need to be Inspector Frost to spot the clues to the future. There was going to be a financial killing. While the network still wanted Yorkshire's programmes, other programme makers wanted its network. In 1997, Granada, the first ITV company to broadcast to the Moors and Pennines, paid £711 million to buy Yorkshire. John Whiston was appointed Director of Programmes.
If I could describe my first day at Yorkshire, I walked in the door and there was a huge, great big 15-foot silver chevron, the symbol of Yorkshire Television, and it was sort of moving round in a kind of slightly ominous way. It would circle round. And I just said to somebody, "That's a bit naff, isn't it?" And at lunchtime I came back down and it had disappeared completely. I was Director of Programmes and my word was law, and suddenly they must have had 15 men and 10 lorries to get rid of it. And that was sort of the kind of atmosphere that was there. There was a guy following me round in a suit and a tie with a sort of Yorkshire chevron on it for about half an hour, and I kind of turned to him and I said, "Who are you? What do you do?" He said, "I'm your chauffeur." And it was just completely bizarre, different era of kind of car coats and cigars.
When ITV was created, it became the second of 2 channels available in Britain. By the time Yorkshire lost its separate identity, there were 302, 402, and television was just one among many entertainments. That commercial competition is one reason you get I'm a Celebrity at 9 p.m. now, rather than Johnny Go Home. But whatever the reasons, the effects have been immense. Over the last decade, ITV has progressively retreated from its original regional structure. A network centre in London, where John Whiston is now Creative Director of ITV Studios UK, directs business around the country. The drama studios in Leeds were emptied of almost everything except Emmerdale, and those in Manchester also reduced their output. London Network Centre informed the government that it no longer felt able to provide local news coverage, a crucial element of regional franchises throughout commercial television's history. Most of the people we've heard from in this programme are figures from ITV's past who ask questions about what has happened. John Whiston, still in position, has to answer them.
I think part of the problem about ITV was part of what made Yorkshire great in the past, i.e. all those different regional centres, which were built up in a time when money was very plentiful. They kind of got ITV very addicted to just straightforward advertising revenue, which was flowing in, and it meant that the good times were always there. And I think what it meant was also that ITV didn't start the process of consolidation early enough in order to sort of fit itself for the new world, a world in which they weren't a monopolistic broadcaster, a world in which advertising revenue wasn't sacrosanct, and a world in which we've got thousands of channels and in which ITV has to compete for every viewer.
Regional news is another symbolic example for people. It was very strong at the beginning. It's now become a symbol of something that ITV can't afford to do anymore, and they're having to find new ways of doing it, as we know. It's going on at the moment. Could ITV really not afford to provide regional news, or did they just not want to?
I think broadcasting used to throw off, well, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, we were sort of making something like £450 million profit a year. This last year, at the peak of the credit crunch, broadcasting actually wasn't making any money at all. So all the money that was coming in from advertising was being spent on the schedule and going back out the door. The only bit of ITV that was making any money was production. And I think, people don't quite understand the extremity of that as a situation. ITV was in a survival mode. And yes, regional news is great. It's great to provide it, and we still do provide it. We've got 9 regions providing it, and we've got 66 people working in Yorkshire still providing it, and providing it in a slightly different way, where you're using your resources in a different way, more mobile, not quite so sort of studio-bound. But economic reality has to be taken into account. You can't carry on with a fantastic regional news service and then go into bankruptcy. It's just not the thing to do.
There is clearly a view among local people, among local MPs, that the previous system, it provided a lot of local employment.
Well, one thing, we still make 3 hours of quality drama a week with Emmerdale, employing 200, 250 people week in, week out. And we still do make quite a bit of stuff out of Yorkshire. We're still got another Frost to come out, and we're doing other things with David Jason. So there is employment being created in Yorkshire in television. But you can't look to ITV simply to be, we're not sort of, a government-funded start-right scheme for employment. What we are is a commercial broadcaster whose duty is to try and create the most compelling and inventive schedule that we can on the money that we can get from the various sources that we can get it.
The paradox of this is that while the government was allowing ITV to become more London-centric, it was ordering the BBC to become less so. Plans for the corporation to establish new power bases in Salford and Scotland were part of an attempt to make British broadcasting more regionally representative.
I think it's essential in this country to get things out of London and to establish vibrant centres of production and skills in the regions. The BBC's transferring to Manchester, but that's a restoration of the old Granada monopoly of the North, that the North will be provided as it was in 1968 by a big provider in Manchester. That's wrong.
30 years after the Mike Sam's Singers had welcomed viewers back to ITV after the strike.
Welcome, welcome, welcome home to ITV.
This was now the theme tune of ITV.
Every step I'm taking, every move I make feels lost with no direction. My faith is shaking.
Reality TV shows, including The X Factor, now mainly filled the slots once available to documentary makers such as John Willis.
What happened to Yorkshire is a perfect parable for what happened, and I look back now at the phenomenal creativity across all genres, not just documentaries but comedy and drama. You look back on that fantastic sense of being new and fresh and energetic, and it's really sad, and it's not just sad for the people who were there but sad for the viewers, that just disappeared.
It's a climb. Yeah, yeah.
Archive on 4. The ITV Story was presented by Mark Lawson and produced in Manchester by Helen Lee.